following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Hello and welcome. Welcome to the program called Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And I am Claire Hall, who you will find behind this microphone every week, and my every now and then co-host and dear friend Gabriel Schechter is with me for this edition. Always a treat. Gabriel, how are you today?
I'm fine today. It's great here in Oregon, Claire, as you know.
Yes, it is. I mean, after what seems like a very damp winter, even by Oregon standards, it's dry today. There's some sunshine, and so
yes,
we're always ready to have fun talking baseball. Recently, we devoted a half an hour to cheating in baseball, and so for a follow-up, let's talk gambling. And, you know, whenever people think about baseball and gambling, no doubt the Chicago White Sox scandal of 1919, the bribery to throw the World Series comes to mind, and I don't think we need to dwell too much on the same old ground, but the one thing I find, and maybe we can use this as a jumping off point, to casual fans, they sometimes think that the Black Sox scandal was an aberration, and really it wasn't. It was more a culmination of trends that had been building in professional baseball since the very start. True?
Oh, absolutely. It's analogous to what we've experienced in the last 2 decades with steroids. Sort of a well-preserved but open secret that players were doing these steroids for years. There was no rule against it. And when they put a mechanism in for trying to detect it, we wound up with the Mitchell Report and a whole generation of tainted accomplishments. The same thing happened a century earlier with betting on baseball. It was openly done. There was no rule against it. I've seen clippings, Charles Comiskey, Connie Mack being happy because their bets won, and John McGraw regularly bet on World Series that his team participated in. And it was, so the gambling and gambling in the stands was just a normal part of daily life in baseball until it corrupted the game to the point where a World Series was compromised, and then they finally did something about it.
You know, I wish I had a lot of classic tape loops queued up the way Jim Healy, who did a great sports show in Los Angeles for years, could. And if I did, now would be the time to have Claude Rains from Casablanca saying, "I'm shocked to find out gambling's going on in here." So let's fast forward from 1919 and 20 and the Black Sox scandal to 1989 and the Pete Rose gambling scandal, which, what to say? I mean, it still seems to be on the forefront of so many minds today, more than 30 years later. And again,
absolutely.
The fact that this beloved player, the all-time hits leader, was exposed for violating the cardinal rule, which in large part stems from the legacy of the Black Sox scandal, that no player, manager, or umpire or coach is allowed to bet on the game.
We have to make one quick stop along the way, and that's in
yes, sir.
the winter of 1926-27. a lot of people, a lot of fans don't realize that betting on baseball was still legal after the Black Sox scandal. In a continuing effort to cover up the existence of gambling, they tried to just let it slide under the carpet. But in that winter, there were charges made against Ty Cobb, Tris Speaker, two of the two greatest stars in the American League. No need to go into the details, but they were accused of conspiring to throw a game back in 1920, I believe it was, maybe before that. And they were exonerated by Judge Landis, but Landis at that time put in the rule that nobody involved in the game can bet on it. So the rule doesn't go back to the Black Sox. It resulted from that scandal, but it wasn't until 1927 that the rule was put in. I've been in a couple of major league clubhouses, and it's in a big kind of a plaque right inside the door leading in there, and it's the last thing you look at or can see before you leave the locker room to go out on the field and play. So there were a number of people involved in gambling over the years, and occasionally they were called in on the carpet, and sometimes quietly, sometimes not. The most memorable was Rogers Hornsby, who found himself in Landis's office. Hornsby was a degenerate horse player, as were, it seems, most of the players involved in gambling over the years, including Pete Rose. But this was after the stock market crash in 1929, in which Major League Baseball had lost money in investments. So Landis tried to give Hornsby a hard time about his horse playing, and Hornsby froze him with a look and said, "At least I was gambling my own money." and that was the end of that case. But along came Pete Rose 60 years later. Where do you want to start?
Okay, so well, first, I think the fact, you know this better than I do, but it is being a former employee of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. But a lot of folks, I find, don't really realize that it is the Hall of Fame is a totally separate and distinct entity from MLB Incorporated. And so, for instance, Pete being placed on baseball's permanently ineligible list by Bart Giamatti, the commissioner at the time, did not render him ineligible for the Hall of Fame. That was something, you weren't with the Hall of Fame yet, but talk about, why don't you, the process that led to the decision that essentially barred the door for Pete.
Yeah. There had never been anything specific in the Hall's election procedure to bar anyone from consideration. In fact, Joe Jackson got 2 votes for the Hall of Fame twice, and nothing was done about it. In 1989, Joe Jackson could still get votes, conceivably, and so did Pete Rose. So Rose had retired after 1986, and so the question became, what do we do in 1992 when he becomes eligible? As it happens, I was in Cooperstown in 1991-92 when all this was festering, and I was at the induction in 1992 when Fay Vincent left in his limousine. I was part of the crowd that was chanting, "Where's Pete? Where's Pete?" But how that came about is that the Hall of Fame people did not want Pete Rose in there, and they realized they had to do something about it. And in the files, I found a memo from Bill Guilfoyle, the number 2 man at the Hall of Fame to the head of the board from 1991, saying, "Listen, we have to do something about this. If we don't want him in, we need to take care of it. Do not let the writers decide this." I'm paraphrasing, but that was the gist of it. And that was the genesis of the addition of the. There had been an integrity clause, but it was very, very bare, and they updated that statement to include the fact that anyone on the ineligible list would be ineligible from ballots. So that happened in 1991, 2 years after Rose, and they put it in place in time to make sure that, he would not be on the ballot. He still got, I don't remember exactly, maybe 40 or so write-in ballots in 1992, and I think something was done to prevent writers from doing that in following years.
Fascinating, and a debate that still rages almost 30 years later. I mean, if you go on almost any baseball discussion page on Facebook, there was one I had to chuckle after the latest scandal, the Astros sign stealing scandal. Pete used it as an opportunity to announce that he was petitioning for reinstatement and using it as justification for reinstatement. And the administrators of a... Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it seems kind of sad that your big argument is, hey, they were worse than I was.
I totally agree. But I think the funny thing about this was the administrator used their privilege to turn off commenting for this post and say, sharing this for information purposes, but I really don't want to see the 10,000th discussion of Pete's Hall of Fame case on this page. But it seems to me, and would you want to address he did it too, or he did something worse, that people will say there are racists, drunks, gamblers. Well, you cited the Hornsby example. People not of good moral character in the Hall of Fame. So what is your response to those who say if all those other folks should be in, then why not Pete? It's not the Hall of Morals, it's the Hall of Fame.
When that's an argument that's not just limited to morality. When I worked at the Hall of Fame library, we got constant queries from fans or emails and statements saying so-and-so should be in the Hall of Fame because he had a higher batting average than these 6 guys who were in the Hall of Fame, or he drove in 2 more runs per season than this other guy who made the Hall of Fame. And that's a dubious and wasteful exercise, pointing fingers and making comparisons. By definition, any group of people will have the least and the greatest. And you can always point at the least. People have made lots of lists of the 10 or 20 least worthy people in the Hall of Fame, players and non-players, and you and I have our own list, but it's an abstract exercise. The reality is that each person should be evaluated on his or her own terms and for what he did in some kind of objective reality, not in relation to what someone else did. That all bears on the next part of the story, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed. And, I think the best argument that I have heard for keeping Pete out is saying that the rule against gambling, it's not a morality clause. It's a protection of the integrity of the game clause, which I'll say, okay, but then, then we start to veer into something in your own story, Gabriel, which I think, given the way this program is veering, we're going to want to save for a follow-up. But what about the increasing, I would say, relationship between baseball and gambling? I think, wasn't there someone who wanted to, for example, there was someone who wanted to buy a team in the 70s, and I hate to say I'm blanking on it, but because he had interests in racetracks, was not allowed to buy in. But nowadays...
That's correct. Mm-hmm. Well, over the past few decades, baseball's hypocrisy toward the issue of gambling has been pretty consistent. What has changed is that it's become less surreptitious and more visible. What I'm thinking of is casino advertising.
Mm-hmm.
You watch a ball game from the center field camera. A lot of teams have put up these rotating advertising signboards on the front of the stands behind the plate. And it's only something being superimposed on that screen. And those regularly carry ads for casinos. I went to one game at Olympic Stadium in Montreal. I think it was 2003. I saw Roy Halladay pitch. And, it was a decrepit franchise at that point. And in the Mammoth Stadium, there was one billboard. It was for a casino. When the Arizona Diamondbacks debuted, when they opened for business, the biggest advertisement on their scoreboard, Mammoth, was for the Las Vegas Convention Authority. MLB is doing business with fantasy leagues now and running its own fantasy leagues and allowing all kinds of access. And it's become less transparent that MLB is perfectly fine with gambling if it increases MLB's revenues. And that, but in all fairness, MLB should not have to have an issue with gambling. I mean, it's only because of their stance on Pete Rose and gambling at the ballpark in general that the hypocrisy exists. If there were never an issue with gambling at the games, then there would be no issue with their advertising it.
Well, one thing I will say, not exactly perhaps in MLB's defense, but just how societal attitudes have evolved. 40 years ago, I believe the only legalized gambling and sports betting in this country was in Las Vegas. Then came Atlantic City. Then came the explosive growth of state lotteries. Then came now just, I believe it was this, within the past year, for instance, that Oregon and I believe many other states have been in this path, legalized sports betting. So, how can you have one hand saying that, no, this is wrong, this is not moral, and the other hand saying that, oh, well, hey, it increases our bottom line, so we're okay with it?
It's just a thorny issue. I mean, but as long as cheating exists, there will be the need to punish people who violate obvious rules. And through all of Pete Rose's career, He knew that rule was the kiss of death. Yet he gambled widely when he was playing. The Reds let him go in '78 as a free agent because he was already he had already built up six-figure debts. And they said, well, let him take that problem somewhere else. And a decade later, it came home to roost for good.
Yeah, exactly. There I would say, again, baseball, very much like the build-up to Black Sox, turning its back on a situation for far too long. And let me play devil's advocate again and see if you would like to respond on this. Some people say, well, barring Pete Rose for life, putting him on the ineligible list, that would be like catching somebody abusing alcohol or drugs and barring them for life. Do you see an equivalency there or not?
Not really. The only parallel I see is that compulsive gambling, like alcoholism and drug addiction, stems from the same source. When I lived in Las Vegas a long time, and I knew what we called triple threats: drug addicts, alcoholics, degenerate gamblers. And when they opened up a clinic that had an effective cure for these, some people went for all three, one at a time. One good friend of mine did the gambling last and said the gambling was the toughest to shed because the gambling doesn't have any physical manifestations. You don't fall down and you don't get incoherent the way you do with the others. You just carry on a normal life, and at some point you go out and blow all your money. So it's a tougher addiction to crack. Maybe the proof of that is that Pete Rose is still a compulsive gambler. He still bets the horses and does all the gambling he wants, and he thinks it's just fine because it's legal. He doesn't bet with bookies anymore. He bets legally. But the sickness is the same, and it's part of the reason why he won't get reinstated, that he still doesn't truly acknowledge that he has a problem. His only problem is getting caught, he thinks.
Which is a shame in a lot of ways. Well, we're reaching...
There's also a semantic...
Go ahead.
There's also a semantic issue in this. And it relates back to Joe Jackson, which is that being put on the ineligible list is a lifetime ban. And therefore, much like the reserve clause, ought to expire when your life does. Which means that, I think in legal terms, Joe Jackson should be eligible. The ban should have been lifted when his life ended. And that's why I think that Pete Rose might very well wind up in the Hall of Fame, but not while he's alive. First, they won't give him the satisfaction. And they don't want a lot of the Hall of Famers boycotting the ceremony. That's one reason the Hall of Fame is glad that Barry Bonds and Clemens and those guys haven't made it yet, because a number of the Hall of Famers threaten to boycott the ceremonies if they let those people in. That's what they say.
And yet
but that matters to the Hall of Fame.
Bonds and Clemens do seem to be creeping closer. It's going to be interesting to watch. Gabriel, hate to say it, we're running out of time, but we have got some great material to share on another upcoming program. We'll just tease people with, I guess we could say, in a way, how gambling kept you out of the Hall of Fame for a while, and how gambling invaded the Hall of Fame in a certain sense. I think it's, ironic, hilarious, showing the inconsistency of the human mind, but all those things and more. So we'll save that for an upcoming program, but always a pleasure. I very much thank you for your time. Want to wish you a great rest
Same
of the
to
day.
you, Claire.
And let's hope it stays sunny through the weekend. And for everybody listening along Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, until we meet again, happy trails.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices, and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.